They had finished assembling 20 minutes ago. Zeke stood upright in his flak armour, lasgun at his side, slung at parade ready in the torrential downpour of tropical warm rain. He and the hundreds of others assembled around him stood likewise. They knew their equipment. The M36 Cantrail patent lasgun was a hardy beast, and something as trivial as a little water would not affect it. You could drag it through mud for a mile, and a shock trooper could be confident that when he brought the weapon to bear, it would discharge. He stole a look sideways at his neighbour Francesca and grinned. Rain running down in rivulets from his battle helmet, soaking his cheeks and running off between the armoured sections of his flak vest. The 6-foot-tall guardswoman noticed, scowled, and then, a moment later, spat down on the floor directly in front of Zeke, the liquid dispersing quickly amongst the already streaming, even-floored surface of the parade ground at Citadel Stronghold. Silhouetted at the backs of these assembled troops by the enormous flood illuminators was the Bastion, a tall, defensively crenulated tower, at the murder holes of which sat servo-skulls, their single mechanical eyes glowing red behind the stood-down heavy bolter emplacements they were affixed to. Having so much firepower at his exposed back was something that always made Zeke nervous, even though he knew perfectly well that the servo-skulls controlling them were crypto-secured, and currently on their stand-down protocols. He had a bad habit of imagining the worst happening. Once, he had crossed a high bridge on manoeuvres with the rest of his squad, the bridge taking them over a rapidly flowing body of water, broken up by sharp rocks jutting up from an unknown depth. He had imagined how easy it would have been to simply fall out of formation and jump from that high place, the sensation of falling, and being carried by an irresistible tide to be shattered upon the stones there. Another time he and his unit had been stood down after a full day of physical training in combat gear. It had been a night every bit as soaked as this one, and his section had forged a fire in one of the ruins of the deserted city through the application of spare promethium they had requisitioned from the Chimera's fuel tank. As he watched the fire burn, the new flames licking the scorched metallic ceiling, his comrades had begun the process of drying out their sopping wet gear. Undoing his own saturated flak armour, standing there in his dripping fatigues, he again imagined how easy it would be to simply reach out a hand and feel the hot flames consume his arm, then spread rapidly to the rest of his body and scorch the flesh beneath, wondering how long he would be as a living candle, his flesh as burning wax, before he expired. Each of these thoughts came completely unbidden to his mind, at each of these moments throughout his life. He would have discussed it with someone if he had thought for a moment it would achieve anything other than a shot to the head. He even kept it from his squad mates, who were the closest living beings to him, his family. Some thoughts were best kept to himself. Breaking out of his reverie, he sensed a commotion behind him. A procession of wet footfalls drawing closer, barely audible over the downpour, and the sound of chafingly wet troopers shifting uncomfortably in their war gear. Stepping out of the bastion into the pouring rain, Major Antonius Demeter, his Ogrin bodyguard at his back, beheld the men and women of his dragoons in their perfect parade formation. They were facing away from the tower he had emerged from, and towards the unfurled sky shield platforms at which sat the Valkyrie transport gunships, their twin engines glowing a dull amber as they idled on their stations. Beyond the line of landing platforms, on a clear day, he knew he could have seen the ruins of the city that Imperial records said had once been the capital of this world on Caradon III. Its true name had been lost to time. The garrisoned Planetary Defense Force and Demeter's Dragoons simply knew it as the Ruins. That always made Demeter smile. The planetary governor was an ineffectual man who always tried to keep things simple, with very little attempt at displays of creativity or original thinking. Nobody lived in those ruins anymore, which made it a perfect location for urban live-fire combat training, and Demeter had taken full advantage of it. He had performed his due diligence and posted notices at regular intervals around the large site, denoting it as a live-fire zone. Occasionally, however, there would still turn up the bodies of vagrants and other dislocated ne'er-do-wells, junkers, junkies, criminal elements, the homeless. The first time this had happened, Demeter had been furious and had demanded an explanation from his junior officers and NCOs. It seemed that the casualties, more often than not, were the result of indirect fire drills from mortar teams and other such activities. After a swift investigation, it was determined that no trooper was to be held accountable for the casualties inflicted. Demeter had filed his report, concealing nothing, directly to the office of the planetary governor personally. They were his men, and it should be that it was him that held ultimate accountability for it. The planetary governor, however, had taken no interest in these casualties of Demeter's frequent war simulations, and had made the official ruling of "they had no business in there if they were true and honest citizens of the Imperium." That had been verbatim. Demeter was not sure which he was more personally disturbed by, the needless loss of life, or the governor's careless and dismissive attitude toward it. Not for the first time in his life, he wondered whether he would be so affected profoundly by the loss of life if his rank had come from training at the Schola Progenium, and not the unfortunate series of battlefield commissions that had led to his ultimate command here. He observed his men. He saw boots that had been freshly polished and imperial badges on their flak vests displayed proudly. Their weapons were well maintained and ready to do the Emperor's holy work. It was a sight that had never failed to stir the blood in his veins to fire and righteous fervour. He knew these men and women, like a father knows his children, and they had never failed him. He strode swiftly down the divides between the first and second companies, his passage slapping up miniature eruptions of dark reflective water with his black-booted feet. He wound his way through the gaps between the ranks towards the podium waiting there, between the men and the landing platforms unfurled like metallic flowers. The senior command staff were already there, waiting at the Vox broadcaster. He caught the eyes of them, all watching him as he advanced down the tightly ordered corridor of soldiery. His eyes met a few individuals in the ranks arrayed directly in front of the raised podium. The men in that first company wore dark green berets, and the features of these men and women were marked by their long careers in the Astra Militarum. Some sported bionic implants like he himself did. A servo arm he had acquired after he lost his natural one in a bitterly fought victory against a traitor regiment, shortly before his fateful promotion to Major. He exchanged nods with a couple of those individuals that had been with him there in those final bloody hours. Leaving his hulking Ogrin bodyguard at the base of the steps, he ascended the short distance to the elevated platform. He saw Lieutenant Taylor stood by the Vox amplifier, with the 4 other members of Demeter's personal command staff. The Major smiled again at that sight. He saw a man trying his best not to show himself up on the eve of his first deployment at his new posting. Antonius Demeter had worn that expression himself more than once, and knew first-hand the hushed sense of master turmoil that must have been taking place beneath the calm surface, that would have fooled a less experienced eye. A large man, with the stripes of a colour sergeant, bearing the regimental standard of the Cadian Gate, which was now flapping wetly in the wind, greeted his arrival. "Major," he said. "Craster," he replied. He liked Craster. He had a way of saying what everyone else was thinking openly and honestly, irreverent to rank and decorum. He was also a seasoned veteran of many campaigns, but had been the former trait that had commended him so strongly to the command squad. And he never disappointed. Try and keep it brief this time, for throne's sake. Me smalls are soaked through and wedged right at where the Emperor's light don't shine. I'm sorry to inconvenience you, Colour Sergeant. Well, I think they've all waited long enough. He stepped up to the transmitter to address the assembly. Rain bouncing and pouring off his tan-coloured peaked cap, worn tight and low on his brow. Before he could speak, the whole body of infantry before him snapped to attention, a singular martial thud of hundreds of boots slamming into the parade ground echoed through the space. Men and women of the CA Dragoons, he began. Thank you for stopping by, he said. A few chuckles from the veterans of First Company. The parade lines of rank and file behind them remained still and silent at attention, the company commissar glaring at them. Troopers! Comrades! There is trouble in the Jellicoe system. The hive world on the second planet has come under assault, and the Prometheum processing facility is in jeopardy. The Xenos are once more menacing our people. As the nearest capable force trained in urban warfare, we are being deployed in support of its defence. And so we are going over there, and we will unleash more firepower than has ever been recorded in the history of our own small regiment. We will be operating alongside our sisters in the Adeptus Sororitas, who find themselves sorely pressed by this threat. At the mention of the Sisters of Battle, he thought he heard a ripple of awe echo back at him over the rain. He could not blame them for that. The Sisters were a manifestation of the Emperor's own light, and any chance to operate alongside them was a blessing, a tale to be remembered and told for the rest of their lives. He brought them back to the matter at hand, adding steel to his voice. Countless numbers of the Imperium's people are being slaughtered like vermin. We have but one purpose, to preserve the Imperium of mankind and all that shelter in its light. It is our sworn duty as members of the Imperial Guard to defend its people, and we shall bring the Emperor's own hammer down in vengeance upon them, and any who seek to extinguish that light. He flexed his augmetic fist, seeing the water drip from the sleeve. He drew the power sword at his side with that fist in one deft, swift motion that was a blur, and held it aloft before him, pointing forwards towards the heads of the assembly. He turned his gaze back to the men assembled before him. I know you, and I trust you all. I know you will do your part. But now I must expect and demand your very best. You have been idle, through no fault of your own, but you have not let your blade dull. Through countless exercises that would have resulted in high mortality rates in any other regiment, you have kept your edge. Through experience and memory of purpose that others may have forgotten between battlefields, you have kept your edge. Ours is an obscure regiment, made from the gathered experience of many others, of orders of battle. Each singly have performed great deeds, but together you are stronger. You are the Emperor's blade. A blade needs no grand lineage. A soldier asks only that it is sharp. We are the Dragoons. We ride into battle on our armoured steeds of land and sky, and our blades cut deeply. And that is because you have made it so. He heard another ripple of approval through the ranks. From his place in formation 4 ranks back, Zeke felt the small hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as a thrill of electric pride ran through him. He stole another look at his companions around him and saw his own pride reflected in their squared jaws and shoulders. The weariness of standing in the rain faded from them all, and every eye was trained on their commanding officer upon the podium, surrounded by his command staff, the colours of Cadia rippling above them like a living thing. Gold and silver threads that were soaked through by the rain seemingly took on a life of their own, glinting from the yellow light of the luminators. At that moment, he thanked the Eternal Protector that he was born Acadian. Major Antonius Demeter drew his blade back in front of his face in salute and activated the power nodule. The blade glowed an azure blue, the hum audible even at this distance. Zeke fancied he could even hear the hiss of the droplets as they flash evaporated on contact with the length of naked powered steel. "Dragoons!" shouted the commander. Zeke felt troopers around him hold their collective breath. They all knew what was coming. "For all that you hold dear, for all that you seek to protect, for all that you would see grow in the Emperor's name, forwards!" Major Demeter stepped back from the Vox amplifier and sheathed his blade. Colour Sergeant Craster and Lieutenant Taylor took his place as the air whined with the sudden noise of twin-vector turbojets of the Valkyrie transport gunships spooled up as one. Taylor tucked his swagger stick under one arm and bellowed out into the pools of light before him. The regimental colours rippled in the wash of the engines. "Defenders of the Imperium, NCOs and department heads, tend to your duties and charges. Fall out!" With a mighty cheer, the assembled men and women charged off the parade ground in disciplined files with an enthusiastic gusto. Forming lines of embarkation at each of the Sky Shield landing platforms, they systematically boarded each in their turn. Zeke and his unit stowed their gear and slapped in safety harnesses, which were then checked by the squad's corporal before securing themselves. The racks were checked by the squad's sergeants, making sure that no straps were loose and that nothing would fall free and rattle around inside the crew space once they lifted off. "Hey, Zeke!" called a voice from the opposite hull bench. He looked up and saw Francesca, her short, cropped, blonde hair soaking, and her face, a face that Zeke thought could be pretty if it wasn't so deadpan and sour at all the time. She met his eyes and raised an armoured fist to shoulder height and gave him a simple thumbs up. Zeke smiled. He was with his family, and that was everything. Last to embark in their own transport, Lieutenant Taylor fell into step with Major Demeter and the rest of the command squad, stepping up the boarding ramp into the transport bay. The servos of the tailgate whined, fighting against the weight of the 4 veterans, the platoon commander, the commanding officer, but mainly for his Ogren bodyguard. They eventually closed behind them, with a faint hiss, sealing the compartment. The rapid plink of raindrops could still be heard against the ablative armour on the hull above them, like impacts of small arms fire. Making sure the Ogren was calmed down first via the aid of his special glow stick, clutched tightly in one massive hand, the rest of the soldiers then strapped themselves in. "Gonna take forever to dry this freckin' flag out," grumbled Craster, fussing over his charge. "Focus on the positive," said a female corporal with a cross painted on one shoulder guard. "There's dry standard issue underwear on that frigate. We're 30 minutes away from knowing what it feels like to be dry again." "I wasn't kidding," said Craster, fidgeting in his seat. "This thing is dug in deeper than a guardsman garrisoning a Joy Girl district." The corporal laughed in derision. "You'll never change." "That's why you all love me," he grinned back, his discomfort briefly forgotten. Taylor was quiet and kept to himself. Lost in his own thoughts, as he usually was on the eve of a new mission, he let the banter wash over him, and he turned his own thoughts inwards towards battle readiness drills, logistical considerations, postponed disciplinary hearings. But each time his mind returned to the Major's speech. That had been something different. He'd served with a lot of officers, mostly those that were products of the schola. He'd never heard anything like that from any of them. Usually a speech, if there even was one, centred around reminding the men of their responsibilities, and whilst that had been true of Demeter's recent oration, his was unique in that it added something else. It conveyed that it wasn't just his duty that compelled him, that motivated him. He seemed to feel fervently about his business, as though he had been called to his post by divine appointment. He had heard such things before, but only from the mouths of the priests and the zealots of the ecclesiarchy. He was jolted out of this when he felt a cold, strong squeeze on his shoulder. He looked up to see the major. "Sir?" he inquired. "You look like a man with a question, Lieutenant," he said, releasing his metal fingers and leaning in toward his subordinate. "Sorry, sir, but I was just kind of not used to hearing a commanding officer brief the rank and file like that. It's just... Usually that kind of thing is left to people like myself, which is then filtered down from platoon to squad level." "Did that make you uncomfortable?" asked the major, with a wry smile on his face. Taylor grappled with his thoughts, trying to put them into words. Demeter waited, knowingly and patiently as he did so. It took him a long moment before he eventually spoke. "No, it was just unexpected. That's all, sir." The older man flexed his augmetic limb into a fist and back again. Taylor had seen him do this a few times now. He'd taken it as one of his commander's habits, or tells. It denoted a moment of careful consideration. "You will learn the way I do things, Taylor, if you stick around for long enough, just as these have." He gestured with his normal arm in the direction of his command squad, who were all locked in their own interactions, paying them no mind for the time being. "You will learn that one of my tenets of belief and qualifications for command is that your men should not only know where they will be fighting, but also the why of it. Sometimes the why can be the most important part of an understanding, not just for a mission, but for our lives in general. It is very easy to order men into battle, Lieutenant, but it is much better if you send them into battle with a set of convictions. Convictions can rally a man in his darkest moments, and force a lowly trooper to lift himself from the dirt and make that one final stand. We are more than just flesh and bone. We are warriors of light, and we should fight back the darkness with our spirits, just as much as we do with our lasbolts, ordnance, and bayonets. Don't you think?" Taylor listened in rapt silence to his commander speak. He spoke with a passion of a wordsmith of old, from a long-lost age of mankind from long ago. The words warred with his own personal sense of cynical reason and bitter experience, and yet he could not help but be aware of the sense of revelation that flooded into his heart. "You once told me yourself, Taylor, that the game, as you put it, must make sense. That is what I strive to do. If you had not made that belief known to me, I might not have taken you into my personal staff. You must be free. You must feel free to be honest with me at all times, Taylor, even if you feel it will bring my wrath down upon you. That is the purpose of my inner circle here. I am very human, and I can be wrong. Will you make this promise to me now, Taylor?" he asked. In a moment of complete realization, Taylor discovered that this man openly trusted him, and that such a trust should only be returned. In a gesture as old as the profession they were in, Taylor reached out with an open palm to shake his commanding officer's hand. "I swear it, sir," he declared. And he meant it. By the Emperor, he meant it.